a piece in the Washington Post like this. Every year, one of the highlights of my family's Passover Seder is when we all whip one another with green onions. It's a custom that originated in the historical Jewish communities of Persia and Afghanistan, and it's fun, a gentle way to remind ourselves of the lashes from ancient persecution. Until fairly recently, I had never experienced it as anything other than a playful diversion. But last spring, something changed. As usual, we armed ourselves with scallions, and when it was time, I cheerfully told my boys, 5 and 8, that they could hit each other. Like the other adults, our 8-year-old was alive to the ritualized aspect, and he gently flicked that scallion at our 5-year-old. His little brother, though, eyes full of mischief, reared back, whacked him as hard as he could, and laughed. And then our 8-year-old cried. Resnick continues, I have thought about this episode more than once over the past year. My children probably don't remember it, but for me, it looms large, and in a fashion that feels almost mythic. It represents so many archetypal aspects of a Jewish childhood, or perhaps any childhood. The jokes that are not entirely jokes. The rigors of brotherhood. The specter of violence that is present even in our most precious and comforting stories. What shall we do with the story of Passover this year? It is always a story that contains violence, enslavement, plagues, a pursuing army. But this year, the violence has not remained within the story. It's in the newspapers. It's in people's current lives. There are people held hostage. There are people who have become homeless and who are starving, living in the midst of a war. There are students rallying for a ceasefire, for divestiture of their universities from armed dealers and from Israel. There are those who say, how can there be a ceasefire without release of hostages? There are those saying divestiture means nothing. There are many trying to thread the line between critiquing Israel and avoiding anti-Semitism. Rabbi Resnick writes, more profound than scallions and more urgent as we prepare for the first Seder in the long shadow of October 7th is one of the core statements in the Haggadah, the book used as an aid in telling the story of the Exodus. This is the promise. Not only once did they arise to destroy us, rather in every generation they arise to destroy us. But the Holy One, blessed be, will save us from their hands. In every generation, indeed. That fear and that hope is something our Jewish members and neighbors, some of you, may live with. Tri-UU's Building and Grounds chair asked if they needed a safety monitor for last night's Seder, and they had one. Don't think that person had any need to do anything, but they were concerned enough that they were there. In The Conversation, an article titled, When Does Anti-Zionism Become Anti-Semitism? A Jewish Historian's Perspective, that was published March 27th. It says, in part, an awareness of this ongoing history of persecution of the Jews is important to understand the trauma of the October 7th attack by Hamas southern Israel, during which 1,200 people were killed and some sexually assaulted, and around 240 people abducted. It was a watershed moment for Israelis as well as the Jewish diaspora. It also helps to understand the Jewish perspective on some of the rhetoric heard at global protest against Israel's subsequent war in Gaza, and more broadly against Zionism since October 7th. To many, this equates with anti-Semitism. Much ink has been spilled on the issue of whether protests against Zionism or anti-Zionism are inherently anti-Semitic. Certainly within the academic realm, anti-Zionism does not necessarily conflate with anti-Semitism. As Michelle Goldberg recently wrote, anti-Zionism can emerge from those who believe in the potential for Israelis and Palestinians to live together in the same state, or from well-intentioned concerns for Palestinian suffering, among other reasons. However, when the real-life impact of anti-Zionism results in cries advocating for the killing of Jews, then it can only be understood as anti-Semitism. As is any criticism of Zionism or Israel that crosses the line to blatant racism or discrimination, demands to deplatform or exclude Zionists, the resurfacing of tropes and conspiracy theories about Jewish people, or questioning of Israel's right to exist as a state. In recent years, efforts have been made to define anti-Semitism, to show how it intersects with attitudes toward Israel, and to draw clearer lines explaining when anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism. This culminated in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's adoption of a working definition of anti-Semitism in 2016. While stressing that legitimate criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, 7 of its 11 examples of anti-Semitic behavior relate to Israel. These include denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming the existence of the State of Israel as a racist endeavor, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. To date, 38 nations have accepted this definition of anti-Semitism. But some scholars, including those who would consider themselves anti-Zionists, have rejected that definition and developed and signed another, known as the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. A small minority of Jews who oppose Israel's existence as a Zionist state adhere to this definition. For other Jews, it is seen as a more accurate definition because it is less prescriptive than the IHRA definition, and also seeks to clarify when criticism of or hostility to Israel or Zionism crosses the line into anti-Semitism and when it does not. For instance, it says, critiquing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism is not anti-Semitic, while denying the right of Jews in the State of Israel to exist and flourish would be. The article ends, our aim should be to work towards understanding each other's pain and learning to listen to each other with respect, even if we choose to agree to disagree. We seem to have a long way to go toward that goal. A big part of the story of Passover is that in remembering one's own people's pain, one's heart should become open to the pain of others. That's why I chose that piece from Deuteronomy as our opening words. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Act accordingly. Our current statement of the sources of our Unitarian Universalist faith tradition includes this source, Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. And just what would that look like? The proposed change to our bylaws puts it like this: love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are, and despite them being inseparable, I'm not going to share them all, but just two that I think are most relevant. Pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. And justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our congregations, our association, and society at large. That goes far beyond not hitting your brother hard with the scallion. Is it even possible? But another part of the Passover story says that the sea did not part for the fleeing Israelites until the first Israelite took that first step in. Let us be brave enough to take the first step toward love and justice, and then see what miracle may occur. I end with a Passover reading from the Jewish Fund for Justice. In every generation, each person has the obligation to look at oneself as if personally brought out of Egypt. We have discussed liberation and sung its praises. We have recounted oppressions and remembered its tears. We have numbered our blessings and offered our gratitude. Still others could not celebrate liberation. Others yet shed tears. Others cannot yet sing out Dayenu. Others yet hunger for redemption. Each one of us has the power to act as an agent of redemption, if only we can see ourselves as the Holy's partners in pursuing justice. I can stay the tears of others if I can see myself diminished by their sorrow. I can hasten the time when everyone will be able to rejoice in freedom if I can see myself as the companion of those fighting against oppression. I can honor the history and the struggles of my own people if I can respond to the struggles of people everywhere to gain dignity and deliverance from bondage. When I look at myself in the mirror after this celebration of freedom, who will I see? Our closing hymn is 400.